Hi, everyone. I'm Jay Wong, Director of the USC Center on Public Diplomacy. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's program. With social media and artificial intelligence revolutionizing how we perceive and interact with the world around us, we are also seeing a surge in misinformation and disinformation. So what is the role of public diplomacy in mitigating the influence of state-sponsored disinformation? And to do that, we first need to better understand the mechanisms underlying common disinformation strategies. And to help us unpack these mechanisms, we are very delighted to have CPD faculty fellow, Professor Eric Nesbitt, join us for a conversation about the psychology of state-sponsored disinformation campaigns. And this topic is important because policy discourse has focused on the technological dimensions of disinformation campaigns and operations, with insufficient attention paid to the underlying psychological factors driving the success of state-sponsored disinformation campaigns. At the same time, the scientific evidence about disinformation strongly suggests that the belief in false or misleading information is driven more by individual emotional and cognitive biases, sometimes amplified by macro social, political, and cultural trends. Professor Eric Nesbitt is the Owen Kuhn Endowed Professor of Policy Analysis and Communication and Director of the Center for Communication and Public Policy at Northwestern University. His research lies at the intersection of communication, public opinion, public policy, and in the areas of science, technology, environmental policy, governance, and elections, and international security. An expert on cross-national survey methodology and field experiments, Professor Nesbitt has led research projects in a wide range of countries. And also, he has collaborated with CPD on a number of evaluation projects. Eric, it's very nice to see you. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I turn the floor to you.
Thank you, Jay. It's my pleasure to be here with you and everyone in the audience and talk about some of our research and expertise we've been putting towards this question of the psychology of state-sponsored disinformation campaigns and implications for the practice of public diplomacy. I'm going to share my screen with you. This lecture today, this presentation is based upon a journal article we published in the Hague Journal of Diplomacy a few years ago, and an updated version, expanded version is forthcoming, and a new handbook of public diplomacy co-authored with Dr. Olga Kamenchuk, who's also at Northwestern University, and edited by Sean Aday. So I think this handbook will be a great tool and resource for those who engage in public diplomacy practice and of great interest to you. So this lecture is based upon our chapter in that handbook. So when we talk about public diplomacy and disinformation, Jay provided my sort of key critique here, right? That when I define disinformation as false or misleading information that influences public opinion or obscures the truth, it can be for material gain, clickbait, right, to gain money, monetary incentives, material incentives, or some type of political gain, whether it's international or domestic, right? That's sort of my working definition of disinformation here. that we're employing in this chapter. And our critique is that not enough attention has been paid to the social psychology of state-sponsored disinformation. We understand the role of algorithms, its spread through online networks, the role of bots, other types of influence mechanisms, diffusion mechanisms online. But really, what we need to understand is that all this sort of diffusion and prevalence of disinformation wouldn't matter if it didn't sort of prey upon basic sort of psychological, cognitive, emotional biases that target among audiences, that they prey upon and target. And that's what I really want to focus on for today. So what I want to talk about are sort of the underlying sort of psychological mechanisms of influence, what I call sort of three sort of archetypes of disinformation strategies. Now, often you see these in combination with each other. They might not be singularly employed in a particular campaign. But the three types of disinformation strategies, if you want to disaggregate state-sponsored sort of campaigns, one is preying upon what I call identity grievance, which I'll talk about in a minute. But it basically is co-opting and using disinformation that aligns with strongly held, often polarized political, social, ethnic, religious identities, or preying upon sort of pre-existing grievances within a target population. The third type of strategy you see in disinformation campaigns is what often I call information flooding. Others might call it the fire hose approach. You saw that even with the COVID-19 pandemic. That was not necessarily state-sponsored, but the infodemic, they sometimes is called. But basically, this is a rapid proliferation of false and misleading information online, offline, that saturates the information space, right? Where it becomes almost impossible for audiences to tell what is true versus false, right? It overwhelms our cognitive ability to do so. The third type of sort of disinformation strategy I want to point out and talk about cognitive biases around is what I call incidental exposure, almost banal disinformation campaigns. This is where what sometimes we call low information voters, sort of everyday citizens, where they're exposed to false and misleading information that is embedded in news, for example, whether it's state-sponsored international channels, online, radio, broadcast, right? Maybe it's a mix of real news combined with false or misleading disinformation pieces, all right? And this often takes advantage of the fact that we often use our feeling about whether something is familiar or not, whether to judge its accuracy. It's basically sort of repeated accidental, incidental exposure to false or misleading information to the point where audiences believe it's true or give it credence, all right? So these are the three types of campaigns I want to unpack today a little bit. So identity grievance campaigns. As I mentioned, these types of campaigns focused on polarized, strongly held religious, political, racial identities, where you see Russia taking advantage of Black Lives Matter in the United States, or the debate around vaccination, for example, polarizing that debate. Or you saw disinformation around Brexit in the UK, right? These campaigns are primarily negative in tone and emotional valence. And they're also amplified by what we're seeing is sort of the problems of late stage democracy, right? The rise of right-wing populism, economic inequality, these grievances that are being articulated in domestic politics, right? Often along very polarized political, ethnic, national identities around immigration, politics, religious conservatism, for example, exploiting real perceived wrongs, racial injustice, right? And they're designed to activate these very negative emotions and responses, fear, anger, right? That will manipulate target populations. These are sort of and these are often what you see is often you see these campaigns highlighted in mass media and in our case studies around PD around the world, right? So the two sort of psychological mechanisms that we need to be cognizant of that these campaigns take advantage of in their messaging and try to align. The first one is called what we call motivated reasoning, right? And this is probably a term that many of you have heard before. The idea is that we often have different motivations when we're assessing information. One is to be accurate. We want to be right, right? We want to have the right answer, right? Understand what is true from false. That is one motivation. But the other motivation is more directional. One of our key human biases is that we want to be consistent, right? We are averse to inconsistency between what we hear, see, are exposed to, and what our pre-existing beliefs are about the world around us, our values, our ideologies, our identities. And we want to reconcile that inconsistency, and usually it's in the favor of those strongly held pre-existing beliefs, right? This reduces our cognitive dissonance, right? Makes us feel better and protects our sense of both our personal identity of who we are and our social identity and connections to, for example, based upon racial, political, religious identities that we share with others within our networks and our communities, right? We have a common set of beliefs, right? And if we're exposed to information that challenges that common set of beliefs, that's something we need to somehow reconcile. And usually reconcile in the favor of maintaining those beliefs and those connections, right? This directional motivation, it's very emotional, right? It's often, motivated reasoning is often described as reasoning infused with emotion. We rationalize our feelings. And this is biased us even if we're making spur of the moment, quick decision making, but even when people think about it more systematically, right? About complex questions, this can bias their thinking to rationalize. So it doesn't mean that this relies upon sort of quick, sort of spur of the moment emotional thinking. Even when we think more systematically, this directional thinking, these emotions can bias what we come up with and how we reconcile information, whether we're more open to information, false information that is consistent with these pre-existing beliefs, or we reject accurate information or fact checking that is inconsistent. Right. The other sort of related concept I want to bring up when it comes to these identity grievance campaigns is this idea of effective polarization. Right? Effective polarization is something that was termed in the United States to talk about sort of what we call sometimes negative partisanship, where Democrats and Republicans have very strong negative attitudes about the other. Sometimes they basically, for example, Republicans don't necessarily vote for Republicans because they support the Republican candidate, is because they dislike Democrat candidate or Democrats so much, right? Same thing with Democrats versus Republicans, right? But the idea is that this polarization is not so much about ideology or beliefs, but it is about feelings. How much we feel about the outgroup, how much we dislike the outgroup versus our in-group, right? And it might be about politics, could be also about national identity, could be about ethnicity, could be about religion. Again, this is about group-based feelings that disinformation campaigns can take advantage of. And you see this a lot. For example, I'll show you an example with Russian disinformation, for example, targeting feelings about migrants out of the Ukraine war in Eastern Europe, right? Or just migrants from North Africa, as well as this example, right? The idea that Italian nuns have become pregnant after hosting migrants. Migrants and refugees as the outgroup, taking advantage of these strong negative feelings to promote disinformation and then amplify them even more, where it creates social, cultural discord, right? So these negative feelings, again, disinformation can take advantage of. So that's part of this identity grievance. It's both about having a strong identity and then having these pre-existing grievances. And between the two, disinformation we're more vulnerable to disinformation. So what do we do about this, right? If you look at the scientific literature, on this, the research, the evidence, three types of suggested sort of campaigns or counter strategies emerge that, again, address the psychological biases that disinformation campaigns are trying to take advantage of, right? One is identity self-affirmation, right? Part of these campaigns rely upon people feeling threatened, their identity feeling threatened, whether it's their individual identity or their shared identity with others, right? And this is a great gift from, I might be dating myself from back in the SNL days through self-affirmation, right? But the idea is by affirming the identity and values of the audience, right? That their identity is valued. It's okay to feel this way. It's okay to share this identity in terms of being a Republican, being a religious conservative, your ethnic identity, being black, being white, whatever it is, right? Feeling people less threatened, that their identity is less threatened through positive messaging, affirming that. You can diminish the vulnerability to disinformation. And often that means when it comes to like fact checking or counter messaging, embedding self-affirmation within the counter message itself. It's not about providing the facts. It's about dealing with the emotions, right? And then by dealing with so you need both the informational content, but the emotional content of your counter message strategy, right? There's also the same idea with shared identities and values. You want to reduce the effective polarization between groups. Democrats, Republicans, well, we're all Americans, right? Regardless of our ideological differences, right? You want to sort of highlight that in your messaging to reduce that negative affect felt towards the outgroup. What is shared by these different groups, right? Whether it's politics, whether it's language, national identity, or even something just as humans, right? And then lastly is solution efficacy messaging. Again, these campaigns take advantage of more larger grievances, take advantage of pre-existing sort of trends when we see in late stage democracy or internationally, like domestic grievances, political grievances, cultural, social, economic. And so again, in terms of counter messaging, these type of disinformation campaigns are mitigating their harm, focusing on solutions and efficacy, right? Communicating effective solutions to grievances, promoting self-efficacy, that yes, you have a grievance, but here's a positive way to deal with this grievance, right? Often these grievances fester when people feel that they can't do anything about it. And that's where they turn angry, versus redirecting that anger and basically thinking about what are ways that we can at least recognize or acknowledge this grievance and give people a sense of efficacy that there is something that can be done about it in a more positive way that lessens their vulnerability to negative disinformation. So these, and I'm happy to talk about more of these in the Q&A and talk about examples. So that's identity campaigns, the grievance campaigns. The second type of campaign I want to mention is something information flooding, fire hose. And this is the rapid proliferation of false or misleading information, whether it's online, social media, blogs, fake news, through advertising, online news outlets. And the goal of this campaign, compared to the first one, is called strategic distraction, creating uncertainty and doubt, confusion about what is accurate versus inaccurate. For example, the flood of disinformation about bioweapon labs in Ukraine funded by the US, right? And there's plenty of other examples you see. Like basically, you see this flood across different platforms to different outlets, which makes it difficult for people in real time to understand what is true versus false, right? And the idea is by flooding the amount of just the sheer volume of disinformation, it crowds out the space for accurate information, but increases, most importantly, the mental cost, right? The cognitive cost, the time, the effort that audiences have to put towards figuring out what's true versus fiction, right? And it creates a sense of loss of control over the information environment. It may lead to like moral panic among audiences, moral panic among the media, among policymakers, among experts, right? Which in itself can be detrimental, right? Disinformation, regardless of its direct effects, can have indirect effects on creating this sense of loss of control and moral panic, which is harmful, especially for democratic governance, some of our research shows, right? So this is the idea behind information flooding, basically mental cost and moral panic. Right? This mental cost leads to what we call cognitive exhaustion. In our article we published this a few years ago, we have a paper looking at information learned helplessness in Russian propaganda inside Russia around COVID-19 and Russian propaganda targeting Russian domestic audiences about COVID-19 stemming from US funded biolabs in Central Asia, for example. The idea is like this idea of cognitive exhaustion, where people sort of give up, right? They stop trying to figure out what's true or false, whether it's simply fact checking or taking the time to think about it more systematically, right? And this creates anxiety in individuals when they can't understand that that accuracy motivation basically goes away. Um, and when they process news information, they're more fearful because they're not sure what's true or false, and that leaves them open to persuasion, right? This increases the persuasive power of disinformation. If I give up trying to figure out what's true versus false, I'll accept everything as true, even if it's disinformation or misinformation, right? And I'm more open to conspiratorial thinking. Research shows that those who have a sense of loss of control are more open to conspiracy theories, right? So informational learned helplessness, when people feel basically helpless to the point where they have no sense of control, they give up. This amplifies the persuasive power of disinformation when people are flooded with false or misleading narratives in their personal information space. The other, as I mentioned, is moral panic, right? Of course, this is also me in the morning without my morning coffee, as I tell my wife. So it's basically, when we talk about moral panic, it's a widespread feeling of fear, often an irrational one, that some evil person, thing, organization out there, Russian trolls, for example, threatens the values or well-being of society, right? And that's much of the narrative when we think about state-sponsored disinformation, right? Whether it's the United States, Ukraine, or elsewhere, right? And basically creates a high level of concern. But the issue is, we need to be concerned about state-sponsored misinformation, don't get me wrong, but do we need to panic about it? And if we panic about it without really understanding it in a nuanced way, and really how much it actually impacts people or not, how prevalent it is, right? It could actually have harmful effects unto itself and create discord within our governance, right? That is some of the research that we in our own lab have unpacked. We have a piece in Harvard Kennedy School Misinfo review about satisfaction of democracy and the presumed influence or moral panic about disinformation. We have collected data from the 2020 election, and we're collecting additional data. How basically moral panic, and this is actually, there's several, if you Google moral panic and misinformation, you'll see several recent pieces in the scientific literature about its harmful effects on audiences, right? And the mechanism from this, the psychological mechanism of moral panic about disinformation having negative impacts on audiences, is something called the third person effect, where we know from research that honestly, disinformation, exposure to disinformation is rare. It's a small percentage of the population, 5-10% of the population, for example, in the US, max, right? It's limited in its demographics that it targets. It's often very limited and nuanced in its impacts on attitudes and behaviors, right? And it's hard to make direct causal connections. At the same time, the level of policy and media news discourse you see about it might create what we call a third person effect, where we know that individuals don't think they're impacted, but they assume that others are to a high level or degree. They presume that this content, that others are impacted by it more so than actually would be rationally evaluated, right? So it becomes this irrational fear that I, as a voter, are not being impacted by disinformation, but I assume that millions of others are. And then I act on that assumption, that presumption of influence on others, right? We base our judgments on this, right? And what we have found in some of our research with experimental and panel survey is that this presumption of how disinformation, especially its prevalence of disinformation and misinformation in our sort of media ecology, information space, actually reduces people's perceived fairness when it comes to decision making in democracies, for example. They basically undercuts the perception that elections are free and fair if they think that misinformation, disinformation is flooding the information space. It reduces their confidence and satisfaction with democratic institutions and governance, right? Because they feel that there's, again, sort of a loss of control, that the elections, the voting, the decision making of voters are being unfairly manipulated to a much greater degree than in reality. And this undercuts their confidence in democratic decision making and the confidence in outcomes, right? So this is sort of a more pernicious sort of undercutting of our democracy that disinformation and the discourse about disinformation can have, right? Which is very concerning in thinking about. When we think about countering information flooding, we really need to focus on, for example, in terms of information learned helplessness, providing digital tools for audiences to reduce the cost of assessing veracity. You have NewsGuard, for example, created a sort of Chrome plugin to look at the authenticity and credibility and trustworthiness of various web domains as a tool people can use to help them cut through information flooding and infodemics, right? That's an example. Information literacy and education, educating people on how disinformation campaigns work can help make them feel more, have a sense of control over the information environment so they don't give up, right? Even though there's higher mental cost. So either we can reduce the cost by creating digital tools and resources, or make people feel more efficacious. Well, even though it's a higher cost to figure out it's true, they don't give up. They feel they have the cognitive and psychological tools to make that extra effort, right? And then the third thing is our discourse. We can create tools, we can make people be more efficacious, but we also have to reduce panic, where people feel that they're not losing control of the information environment, that others, maybe themselves, they feel okay, but they presume that disinformation is influencing millions upon millions of voters or others in harmful ways, which then impacts their own attitudes about our democratic institutions and our confidence in democratic decision making. Right? So we need to think about our discourse and how we even talk about the problem, because that can actually have harmful effects unto itself. All right, so of our last sort of campaign that I want to talk about is sort of this more banal incidental exposure to disinformation, right? And how it takes advantage of some of our cognitive biases as humans when it comes to how we assess the veracity of information to which we are exposed, right? So the idea here is sort of incidental exposure. Maybe it's embedding false or misleading information within accurate overall, and you see this often with Iranian news, state-sponsored news. 3/4 of the news stories are fairly accurate or true. 1/4 is pure propaganda of disinformation, right? So you're sort of embedding sort of this exposure where people are relying upon, exposed to it through social networks, friends sharing it. Others are exposed to through turning on the TV and seeing a TV broadcast or radio broadcast, online news domain they come across, right? And the idea is that they're just sort of news grazing, or they're exposed to it by accident. And this is what we call unmotivated, right? They're not actually seeking it out. They don't have a strong pre-existing belief or identity, which is motivating them to believe it's true. It's simply that they actually don't care that much, and they don't care to take the time to evaluate it, right? And so often when this case happens is what we call the illusory truth effect, right? The idea is that when we are repeated the same information time and time again, we use our familiarity, how fluent it is. They call it fluency, right? How fluently we recall that information in our memory, in our brain, to assess whether it's true. Oh, I heard that before. That's probably true. Or sometimes it's also called a sleeper effect. We remember the information, but not that it came from a non-credible source. We just remember the information itself, right? That's why it sleeps in our brain, right? And this is a very common bias, especially, you can think about it when something you've talked to your friends or family and you've heard it and you heard it enough times, you think it's true, but it turns out it's not true, right? So this is another sort of cognitive bias that disinformation campaigns that are trying to simply get this false and misleading information in front of the most amount of eyeballs as frequently as possible, all right, to the point where people become so familiar that they think it's true, all right, and then they'll act on it or influences their attitudes when forced to make judgments or decisions based upon that fluency and how easy it to recall in their brains, right? So how do we deal with this? Well, often you can deal with some fact checking, right? Often you see where news organizations, civic organizations, community organizations try to fact check when it comes to often the sort of incidental or banal exposure to disinformation, various resources. One of the problems, though, is that two things. One, fact checking itself can increase familiarity, right? Research shows that when you repeat the disinformation or misinformation in the fact check itself, you actually are making the problem possibly worse because you're re-exposing people to the very information you're trying to debunk, right? And that becomes very difficult, all right? So in terms of a best practice, you want to basically fact check or correct without actually promoting the disinformation itself, where it's, again, familiar, right? The other thing is what we call the continued influence effect, is that when you correct disinformation that people have been incidentally exposed to, it's not enough simply to say the information is false or misleading or incorrect. You need to provide an alternative explanation so people can, okay, retract that false or misleading information. Okay, that's not true. But the judgment, the attitude or decision they based on that false information continues because they don't have anything to replace it with, right? So you need to provide an alternative. Not only, it's not enough to simply say something's not true. You have to explain why and what the alternative fact is. The truth is that, what to basically do the work that false or misinformation was doing in people's brains. All right, that narrative. Because often disinformation is about providing sort of something explanatory about the world. People use that disinformation to make sense of the world. Well, to retract it, you need to provide new information that they can helps them make better sense of the world, right? And I'm happy to talk about more in the Q&A if this seems complicated. So when it comes to counter strategies, we need to promote careful and judgment and deliberation, where people don't simply accept things true at face value that they're being exposed to multiple times. Research shows, experimental research, other types of interventions, and field research shows that accuracy prompts are very effective. This is an example from a recent published scientific study, a type of accuracy prompt they used. Did people think about the accuracy of information so they've been exposed to before accepting that it's true, right? Combined with also news media literacy, so they understand some of these biases. And when to counter this continued influence effect, provide alternative narratives that fill the gap that the disinformation was playing in people's mental models of the world. All right, to provide an alternative mental model to the one that the disinformation was providing, right? To explain why that is false and not true. That false information is inaccurate for them understanding the world around them. In addition, we need clear and digestible, compelling formats. So one of the research areas in this, in terms of countering misinformation and disinformation, is how we present information in sort of narrative formats that are more compelling, so they're more fluent. It's a fight of fluency. What's more easily recalled? What's more easier to align with these cognitive biases? Is it simply repeated exposure to false or misleading information, or to present the counter message to that disinformation in a more compelling format that is easier to recall than the disinformation? That's what we're trying to fight against here. What is more fluent in people's brains, right? So information fluency as a concept is important, especially in terms of message formats in counter messaging. The other insights from sort of the scientific research on counter messaging and dealing with misinformation, disinformation, whether it's from incidental exposure or even other sources, is that visual formats, infographics, are much more impactful than text. You need to use unequivocal language. Fact checks that say something is mostly false or try to be nuanced are actually far less effective, if not ineffective, versus simply saying this is false. It's not mostly false, it's false or true, right? So you really need to hit them over the head about veracity. right? Being nuanced and fact checking actually limits its effectiveness, right? Use straightforward language, avoid lengthy, complex explanations. Again, this is the simpler explanation, the simpler narrative that people can understand, the more easy to recall and plug into their mental models of the world, the more effective it is. You need a single exposure is not just like we know do advertising research. You need repeated exposure to corrections, so that becomes familiar in people's minds to counter repeated exposure to disinformation, right? That they may incidentally be exposed to. And when you actually engage in corrective messaging, you need to avoid any repetition of the false or misleading information and solely focus on the correct information in the message, right? These are some guidelines, best practices in counter messaging disinformation. Of course, fact checking and corrective messaging, as sometimes it's called, in itself is being weaponized. And it's a very difficult space, right? It's much more difficult to fact check or correct false or misleading beliefs once people have internalized them from disinformation than to sort of try to mitigate them up front. And what you see here, for example, this is examples of Russian state-sponsored disinformation, basically using fact checks, their versions of fact checks to promote disinformation around the Ukraine, their invasion of Ukraine and the war on Ukraine, right? So these are comes from Clemson's Media Forensics Hub and Lab, where they have examples of Russians using fact checks supposedly to spread disinformation about the war on Ukraine, right? It's very insidious, if you will, to gain credibility, right? So, there's even contestation about fact checking, right? That becomes very problematic. Whose fact checks do you believe? And this aligns also with identity grievance. Obviously, those with strongly held beliefs or identities on one side or the other of a conflict are going to believe one set of fact checks over another. So from a counter strategy perspective, and you saw this with COVID-19, you see this in political misinformation, you see this in disinformation studies, an emerging consensus of one strategy that tries to avoid this pitfall once people have false or misleading beliefs, how they're so intransient to correct them, is the idea of prebunking, right? And this comes from the idea of inoculation theory, which has been around for decades in the persuasion literature, right? And the idea is to inoculate, much like a vaccination, against disinformation. Now, originally, inoculation theory dealt with providing people a small dose of the false information, and then once you give them a small dose and sort of make them aware of it, that it is false, and explain why, they're more resistant to it once they get the full dose out in the wild, if they will, of the information space. But in this disinformation so rapidly, especially with information flooding, gets into an information space, you don't know what that false or misinformation from day to day might be with these very targeted online campaigns. So pre-bunking inoculation theory has moved away from focusing on pre-bunking specific pieces of information to a degree, and more pre-bunking more the techniques of disinformation. Again, keep people aware of how they may be manipulated from a tactics and strategy. All right. This could be through online videos. There are games that teach people about disinformation campaigns, preemptive refutation, right? So there are a variety of ways that pre-bunking people are experimenting with to see how to make people more resilient and resistant to disinformation virus, if you will, right? I'll give you an example. This is something that Google's Jigsaw put out, a successful campaign they did within the last year, targeting audiences in Eastern Europe, tried to inoculate them against Russian state-sponsored campaigns focused on creating divisions around Ukrainian refugees and migrants in Eastern Europe as a result of the war. I'm going to see if I can show this. It's should be subtitles. Hopefully this will play.
Wojna w Ukrainie trwa nie tylko w terenie, ale także w twoim telefonie. Żeby wygrać tę wojnę, niektórzy będą próbować cię zastraszyć, przekonując, że uchodźcy są niebezpieczni.
Wszystko okej, Paula? A tak, ja będę się zbierać. Bo niebezpiecznie samej po nocach chodzić z tymi wszystkimi Ukraińcami na ulicach. Co? Ci uchodźcy. Ja właśnie czytałam, że jest coraz więcej ofiar ich napaści, atakują ludzi na ulicy.
Paula, przecież to jakieś pogłoski. Czytałaś jakiś bzdur. To jest właśnie zastraszenie.
A skąd wiesz? Czemu ktoś chciałby mnie oszukiwać?
Bo niektórym jest na rękę nastawiać nas przeciwko Ukraińcom, którzy uciekają przed wojną. Łatwiej jest manipulować kimś, kto się boi i odciągnąć uwagę od wojny, która sprowadziła tu uchodźców.
Jeśli ktoś próbuje cię zastraszyć, to może być manipulacja. Zastraszanie to jedna z najczęściej używanych technik szerzenia dezinformacji. Nie daj się manipulacji.
So that is a campaign that was widely viewed of different types of videos trying to educate audiences in Eastern Europe about fear-mongering, identity grievance campaigns, taking advantage of outgroup fear emotions, right? Trying to people have their guard about their emotions being manipulated in a negative way by identity grievance campaign targeting Ukrainian migrants and refugees, right? That's an example of prebunking. So in sum, and then we can we'll have time for questions and Q&A and discussion, which I welcome. Disinformation takes advantage of basic human cognitive and emotional biases, and we need to realize how different types of campaigns and techniques align with different biases, and sometimes take advantage of more than one, right? I show you 3 archetypes. Often they're used in combination. There could be information flooding campaign that's taking advantage of identities and grievances, right? And then we can think about then what are the counter strategies based upon the scientific literature that we can employ in different ways and different formats to counter these different types of state-sponsored campaigns, right? And just as campaigns, state-sponsored campaigns engage in different elements, we need to think about how our counter strategies use different elements to mitigate their harm and refute them. You know, pre-bunking information literacy have emerged as some of the largest sort of population at scale type of efforts that provide a more general sort of resilience and defense to limit the harm of specific campaigns. And so we really need to think of a dual strategy. We can think about specific campaigns that we need to mitigate, encounter in our messaging and refute and correct. And we need to think about building more population level immunity to manipulation, which is difficult at scale among targeted populations. And what are the best ways? Is it educational? Is it K through 12? Is it adult learning? Is it videos? Maybe all the above to create this resilience, sort of this inoculation. But I also want to end with thinking about, you know, one of my critiques, our critiques in this chapter and some of our research is how do we talk about disinformation and misinformation as a problem? How does the media, news media, there's a mantra in those who study news, if it bleeds, it leads. Just as the news media can hype natural disasters, can hype crime, it can hype the problem of disinformation, right? And so as public diplomacy practitioners and experts, we need to think about how do we talk about this in a nuanced way. We need to scope out the problem without creating panic that undercuts people's confidence in democratic institutions and their ability to govern, right? Which is, you know, in some ways, again, that's one of the goals of disinformation. So we don't want to do the work for state-sponsored bad actors by talking about disinformation in harmful ways or less nuanced ways than we should, right? And with that, I will end my presentation and happy to take any questions or discussion that our participants have. And thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much for the presentation and really help us clarify the general discourse surrounding disinformation and providing some of the evidence from your research. So for our audience, please submit your question through a Q&A function on the Zoom. And let me start with one question first. So Eric, I think you may have also mentioned this. The recent studies that's published in Nature and Science using the large-scale data from Facebook on social media impact during the 2020 US election basically shows that algorithms, for instance, did not really alter political polarization, did not really have major impact, you know, changing people's political views or some of the major sort of the indicators of political attitudes. So how is that study and that finding may also be relevant in the international kind of a space, because the study was focused on US election. And do you see similar types of trends and similar types of dynamics at work as well in the international space?
I think, I think a lot of disinformation research is context specific, but not only population, but the topic, right? And so in that, that research is excellent, top notch. It concurs with it's consistent with my understanding of misinformation, disinformation in the United States. The researchers involved, they were in science, nature, and human behavior. Again, it was funded by Facebook, to be clear, but the researchers are all independent, great methods, and they showed a very limited impact of the algorithm itself, right? But the question then is, the three components of disinformation: there's the algorithm, the technology, there's the content, and the audience, right? And so in my perspective, that means then, as disinformation is a problem, it's an issue of audience and content, and then also possibly actor, right? So, maybe it wasn't Facebook spreading misinformation, but you have political actors, politicians spreading misinformation, right? So it wasn't necessarily the algorithm, the technology, as much as the source, the content, and the population. Those are the three other ingredients, if you will, right? So I think that mix of ingredients, the technology, the platform by which disinformation spreads, the source, the explicit source, right? Whether it's domestic politicians, international politicians, or domestic politicians help promote international disinformation from international sources, the pre-existing cognitive biases of the audience, and how effective the content is, that will determine whether a campaign is really effective or not. Right. And what they showed in this study is that it's not, the technology is not a sufficient condition, right, for spreading mis or disinformation, influencing attitudes or opinions, right? I also think that they looked at an election where we have such level of polarization, right, that some of the attitudes are not going to shift as much as you would think. But where there's less polarized attitudes about a candidate or a new emerging topic that people are trying to make sense of, like, thinking about COVID-19 when it first came on, or thinking about Ukraine war, a new emerging where it's new, it's novel, that's where disinformation can play a huge role in influencing the narratives, influence people's opinions, because people don't have a lot of basis upon which to judge. And they don't have even specific pre-existing beliefs about that. They might have pre-existing identities, like I'm a strong Republican or Democrat, and then I use these lenses to make sense of something that's novel, and disinformation can play off of that. Versus I have strong pre-existing beliefs about Biden and Trump prior to any exposure that disinformation is not going to influence. So it depends on the novelty and familiarity with the topic that campaigns can take advantage of. I hope that that's maybe more nuanced, but I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. It's like these critical discourse moments, and how do you define them? And it's very context specific, and how this disinformation can have a huge impact, even though, as you say, most of disinformation actually reaches very small segment of population, right? But we do see certain disinformation that is much more widespread.
And I think with state-sponsored disinformation, that a key issue of success is not only direct exposure. Do you find domestic actors who start amplifying it for their own political purposes? It's not that, for example, you've seen that with the discourse about U.S. bioweapons in Ukraine, biolabs in Ukraine, right? That aligned with some right-wing and left-wing populist narratives about the war on Ukraine from Russia. And then they become the mouthpieces for it rather than any type of state-sponsored. And that's another sort of a key thing, is that type of distribution and credibility given to state-sponsored disinformation.
Yes. So we have a question about, on the audience side, if the target audience, here's the question, is keen to believe disinformation campaigns as true how can someone persuade them if they see either inoculation attempts or fact checkers as mainstream propaganda? I suppose it's how persuadable are people in the face of disinformation.
Right. So in terms of, again, identity, like, so the research shows that usually when in terms of like identity grievance, when you have strongly held political beliefs, for example, you need to find sources of the best source of that type of messaging comes from sources that share that same identity, that same belief, whether it's political, racial. So it needs to be coming from someone that at least have some level of connection to them in terms of that same shared identity. That will be more persuadable and more credible, right? So, for example, in a conflict situation or internationally, having inoculation or fact checking coming from U.S., for example, sponsored media, right? Radio Free Liberty, for example, is not going to be as effective as coming from domestic media or domestic sources in that country that share that same national identity or political orientation, right? So that is where having civic community organizations that engage with people that share their some level of identity connection as partners in corrective messaging or inoculation type campaigns or education is important. Boots on the ground, if you will.
Here's another question on fact checking. So you mentioned with fact checking not to be too nuanced, but just say false. That makes sense for quick impression, but seems like there is a risk that if people do check and see that it is a 50% false or X aspect of the story is false, then they will not believe the fact checking source and confirming existing biases. Can you speak to that?
Well, the question is, I think that's a good question. Some of this research comes out of different meta-analyses of different studies using different types of language and fact checking. I think, and I'm happy to provide more references to it, but I think what you're saying is, could there be a boomerang effect if you're too unequivocal in a piece of information? And I think it simply is what is something that's 50% true and 50% false, right? Is it true or false? If it's 50%, if it's only 50% true or it's 50% false, it's false, right? I think it's explaining to people why it's false too, right? So why is this statement a false statement, right? You can say false and then give the alternative explanation. So in a fact checking, what you want to say is you don't necessarily want to repeat the false information. You might say a claim is false. This is why, and this is to give them a sense, and most people, for the most part, will not want to spend the cognitive time to dig in and understand it. They would have a different motivation. If you're simply trying to, for an incidental, low motivated audience member who has been exposed to false information and believes something because of repeated exposure to false information, to correct that information, you need to cut through the clutter, say this is false, and provide the accurate information instead, right? In an unequivocal way. And for the most part, that will be effective.
Thanks, Eric. There are several questions about the evaluation aspect of the disinformation campaign in terms of their impact. So, for instance, example that you give, mentioning in Eastern Europe, the anti-disinformation campaign regarding Ukrainian refugees. So the viewer asked, how was effectiveness evaluated beyond views and clicks?
At this point, it wasn't, right? That was their evaluation, right? And that's a good question. I mean, from a purely scientific, the best way to do it is there's two ways. You could do experimental research, right? Where you field experiments where you expose people to some of these videos and not a population, and then track them to see whether future exposure to disinformation or whether their attitudes change over time. You could do population-wide surveys. All that is expensive. part of the reason why we have such a challenge in evaluation is the resources to do comprehensive evaluation, right? That's why we often rely upon impressions, clicks, engagement, shares on top of some of these campaigns, because that is easily transparent information that doesn't cost money to collect. But if you're really going to do evaluation, it takes hundreds of thousands of dollars to do these sort of population-wide evaluation campaigns. Much like that, you mentioned those studies in Nature, Human Behavior, and Science evaluating that Facebook's algorithm, right? That takes hundreds of thousands of millions of dollars to do, right? And so part of, I think, and I know CPD and myself and Jay, we've talked about evaluation for a long time. It's not only the methods of evaluation which are necessary, it's the resources you put towards evaluation, which is the other key component. And that determines how well your evaluation, what you can say about that evaluation.
Thanks, Eric. So a question about what you see are the key indicators that can help detect online state-sponsored influence campaigns?
In terms of attributes, content attributes?
I guess just in general, the key indicators.
Right. So
could be, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, I think, sometimes it's what one attribute sometimes you see is coordinated link sharing, coordinated posts, are multiple accounts that are otherwise maybe disconnected from each other, amassed, sharing the same link, the same information, or all around the same time. So I know there's research, that's more of a using network analysis and other types of social media data to basically track coordinated link sharing between various accounts, right? There's a good paper in Information Communication Society looking at coordinated link sharing around, I think, the 2019 Italian election as an example of using that methodology. So that's sort of from a network perspective. We have a paper in Scientific Reports using what we call Sentinel approach to track disinformation, misinformation campaigns. And that's basically comes out of sort of the public health, public surveillance that was funded by the ODNI, the Office of Director of National Intelligence, that was funded one of our projects. And basically there we were trying to identify accounts most likely based upon sort of community detection to share false and misleading disinformation about COVID-19 and then track those accounts over time. So they consider be the canary in the coal mine to see as early warning to identify those accounts based upon their community detection and content that they share when it comes to. So those are network-based approaches that are often used. There could be content-based approaches by looking at the nature of the message, the content attributes, especially negative valence, negative messaging that have a high level of negative sentiment. That's targeting outgroups. That's another one. So, we know the types of campaigns are often employed. Negative emotions targeting outgroups can be likely a disinformation campaign. So those are some of the things that you could look for, I guess.
And what about counteracting disinformation when it is disseminated by high-level officials to their citizens, to their own citizens? And what might be some of the strategies or tactics?
That's difficult. When you have politicians, policymakers, officials themselves being the source of disinformation, whether it's the United States or overseas, that is some of the most difficult to, especially for domestic audiences, to counter. Because people have identity with them, a shared political, religious, ethnic identity with them. There might be a cult of personality around them. They have a platform. Often they're aided and abetted by a sympathetic press, like a partisan press or ethnic press or other types of press, media outlets that they control directly or indirectly. And the best way to do that is to find, again, politicians and policymakers who share the same political identity, ethnic identity, racial, religious identity, who are willing to provide counter messaging. You need, that's where you need to have elites, police elites, right? In that sense, because that can be very difficult to counter. some of our own studies on COVID disinformation and misinformation that we've conducted in conjunction with partners at other universities have shown that often it was not necessarily some of the most widely shared and believed misinformation about COVID-19 in the United States came from politicians or political actors, right? Who had their own megaphone. And often where you had then partisan press or extreme right or left simply then repeating what these politicians said. And that is very difficult to counter.
Well, Eric, thank you so much. And also speaks to that public diplomacy is also about relationship building. It's a longer term project, right? And when you can activate, the champions or the people who can speak on your behalf, it takes a lot of relationship building over time. And as we are talking about more in the immediate information landscape. So thank you so much for this really interesting and but certainly a revealing discussion about disinformation and the attributes and what we may do in the public diplomacy arena to counter disinformation or to mitigate its impact. I want to thank our audience for joining us. Please stay tuned for our future events. And next week, we have a book talk on Africa is not a country to look at the image of Africa and how we need to reimagine the continent. So thank you for joining us and look forward to seeing you at our next event. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jay.